From the gridiron to the hardwood, James Meche breaks it all down. It's time for another episode of Cleats and Sneaks.
The NBA playoffs have been off and rolling so far ever since we got into that middle part of April, and we're already in the second round. So much has gone down. We're down half the teams that made the playoffs, and a couple other teams are already on the verge of getting eliminated themselves. And let's get right into it. Thank you for clicking on for another edition of Cleats and Sneaks. I'm your host, James Meche, where we talk about everything that's going on right now in the NFL and the NBA. And have not been able to give my flowers to the NBA because there's been so much going on with the NFL. Of course, there was still free agency. We were leading up to the draft. But now that that's done and we've got a little bit of a grace period until we get into mini camp and training camp, I can really focus on the NBA playoffs. And let's start in the Western Conference. When it came to the first round, number one seeded Oklahoma City Thunder versus the New Orleans Pelicans. And early on in the season, you looked at this series and you thought, okay, well, this is potential because New Orleans, they were looking really good. The fact that Zion Williamson was out there actually healthy, as well as Brandon Ingram was healthy. You didn't have to worry about CJ McCollum missing a bunch of games either. Their big three were looking pretty good throughout the majority of the regular season. And really, you were anticipating them to not even have to worry about making the play-in tournament. Well, as we got down further stretch of the playoffs and got closer to it, the Pelicans fell. They had the potential of being a 4 seed. They were, for a majority of the time, either a 5 or a 6 seed. Well, when it came down to it, they just missed out by a game. They had to play in the play-in. They lost to the Lakers, and then they had to win to get in as the 8 seed. And that's why they had to face Oklahoma City, Shai Gilgeous-Alexander, Chet Holmgren, and company. It was really a tough matchup because by the time we got to that point, Brandon Ingram had got injured in that last part of the season, finally came back healthy, quote-unquote healthy, good enough to play basketball, but you could tell that he was definitely affected. Zion Williamson, he also was missing the last couple of games and just did not play in the entirety of that series against the Thunder, and they eventually got swept. When you look at the numbers, the Pelicans, they just weren't able to put up points offensively. They played relatively well defensively. I mean, they held Oklahoma City to under 100 twice in the series. But overall, it just didn't matter because B.I. wasn't himself. They refused to use Jonas Valanciunas. Willie Green just isn't a fan of using him. Zion was out. And then C.J. McCollum, when it comes to these big-time games, he's just never able to step up, and he wasn't being given as many open opportunities because of what the defense does whenever Zion Williamson is on the court. They eventually end up getting swept. They averaged about 89 points per game in the series, and it just clearly wasn't their time. You're expecting big things to change for the Pelicans in the offseason, but we'll just have to see what happens. Some guys are probably going to be departed. Some they're going to have to bring it, whether it's in free agency with a signing or a trade, but until then, we'll just have to see. Looking at the next round, the 4 and 5 seed, I want to look at the Clippers and look at the Mavericks because early on you were looking at the big name stars. PG, Russell Westbrook was on the team. James Harden actually got traded from Philly after he was a disappointment with them last year getting eliminated by Boston, heads to LA to go play for the Clippers. And you're thinking, okay, well, this is a really good group because they also have Kawhi. Even though Kawhi, he gets injured a lot, he doesn't play, and he's got load management. He hasn't been the same since he went to Toronto and he left there and he headed to California to play for the Clippers. It just really hasn't been the same for him. And even with that and guys missing at points, you still thought the way they played in the regular season, they looked relatively strong. And I remember before, you looked at the Mavericks because they traded for Kyrie, and we knew that as media and fans of the NBA and fans of Luka and fans of the Mavericks, you looked at them and you were wondering, okay, well, what are they going to do? Because you can't just have it be the Luka show every night because he can only do so much. He can keep your team in the game, but he needs help in other places for them to have a chance of winning. They went to go trade for Kyrie, and Kyrie initially you were worried about it because of what he says off the court, and you always kind of felt like he was a diva. Well, as time has gone along, they're working out pretty well, and Kyrie has matured quite a bit. This is Luka's team. He understands that. And really, he just lets him do his thing. And when he is needed, he gets called up and he goes out there and balls. And it's really become quite a dynamic duo. And they were able to get the series in 6. It was relatively solid because they lost game 1 to the Clippers, but then after that, they rattled off 2 in a row. They lost game 4, but they came back and got game 5 and game 6. Really, game 5 wasn't even close, and same thing with game 6. They were able to close that one out pretty handily, and you could just tell that James Harden, he's not built for those moments anymore, and he really wasn't built for game time situations to get his team into farther parts of the playoffs and get them into the finals. You remember him playing early on his career in the finals for OKC, but outside of that, he has not really been able to sniff it ever since then. PG, he's good in the regular season, but he obviously hasn't been the same. Clearly, Russell Westbrook coming off the bench, he's not one of those guys either. And then obviously with Kawhi, if you're not going to play, how are we going to expect you to do something for this team? Because you can only do so much morally on the bench. Looking at the next one, though, you look at the number 3 seeded Timberwolves, and then you look at the Phoenix Suns. Phoenix Suns were kind of a disappointment because you look at how much talent they had when it came to the starting 5. And you also looked at it because as they made the offseason moves, you were kind of wondering, how is this all going to fit? Because sure, you have Kevin Durant. Sure, you have Devin Booker. You brought in Yusuf Nurkic to replace DeAndre Ayton. And you bring in Bradley Beal and you bring in all these other guys, but you really have no depth. And you're wondering, how much is this starting lineup? How much is Kevin Durant, Bradley Beal, Devin Booker and company, how are they going to be able to carry, and for how long are they going to be able to carry this team? Well, they weren't able to really carry them at all in this opening series against the Timberwolves, and even though Cat was out for a while and they kind of slipped 1 or 2 games in the standings and they ended up being the 3 seed instead of the 1 seed, Anthony Edwards has stepped up. He has stepped up. He has become probably the best player at the moment in these playoffs. When it comes to all the 16 teams that made it into the tournament, I would say Timberwolves star Anthony Edwards, he has taken that next step forward, and he was an integral part of knocking out the Suns in 4 games. We thought maybe Phoenix could win a game or 2 because they were able to make that late season surge, but really it hasn't worked out for them, and you can just tell that the Timberwolves have taken that next step forward, and we're going to get back to them in just a couple of minutes as they were able to dominate the Phoenix Suns in every single game, winning by 25, winning by 12, winning by 17, and then winning by 6 in game 4. It got close, but they were still able to close it out. Then looking at the Nuggets versus the Lakers, we know that the Nuggets have really been able to dominate LeBron James and Lakers the last couple of years. It just hasn't been close. They were able to get 1 game, the Lakers were, but Denver was really just able to close it out. It wasn't too much of an issue. I know that it came down to that game 4 where you were wondering, okay, are they going to actually be able to get the sweep? And they were going to take both from the Lakers' home court. They were able to get the 11-point win, 119-108. But game 5, it also came down close because there was a couple of close calls in the series where even though you look at how dominant the Lakers and Nikola Jokic and Michael Porter Jr. and Jamal Murray have been against the Lakers in the playoffs and in the regular season, these were actually a lot of really close games. Jamal Murray had to make 2 buzzer beater game winners to secure the games because outside of that, the Lakers were giving their absolute best shot. LeBron was trying. AD was very efficient in the series, but when it came down to it late, that Nikola Jokic, Jamal Murray handoff, pick and roll game, that stuff is lethal. They were given chances when you were wondering how are they even going to be able to come back in some of these games. Well, it seems like the Lakers were blaming their head coach, Darvin Ham, for a lack of adjustments later in games, and that ultimately cost him his job as the Nuggets were able to move on to the second round and win in 5. Looking at the East, the Boston Celtics, they were relatively able to take care of business against the Miami Heat. They win that one in 5 for a gentleman's sweep. The only thing for it, though, is the fact that the Miami Heat even got a game against the Celtics was utterly shocking, and it's more of how it went down because it was one of the poorer nights shooting from the Celtics, and we understand that how much the Celtics like to shoot the three ball. They live and die by the three, which worries me when it comes to as we get farther and farther into the NBA playoffs. How much is that going to affect them? Because I remember when they faced the Golden State Warriors, and even last year when they faced the Miami Heat and got eliminated by them in the Eastern Conference Finals, the three ball became too much of a predication by them and how much they focused on trying to shoot the three ball, and they just settled for those long distance shots instead of trying to create mid-range or even shots in the paint or maybe even getting a floater or something like that. They settled too much, and that's what kind of killed them, as well as turnovers, being careless with the basketball. You didn't really have to worry about that too much because of how much the Celtics dominated the Heat in this series. The one game that the Celtics did lose, and it was early on, it was game 2. They didn't shoot the ball very well, but also the Heat. It was a historic shooting night from them. I was utterly shocked at how well they were shooting the ball. They were able to get the 10-point win, but outside of that, Celtics won by 20, they won by 20, they won by 14, and then they won by 34, excuse me. So pretty dominant series from the Celtics. Then you move on to the Cavs versus the Magic. And after seeing the Cavs go up 2-0 in the series, I thought the Magic were dead in the water. I was thinking, okay, this is a young group. I know that outside of Joe Ingles, this is the youngest team in the NBA, and I was proud of them for them to be able to make those strides forward and make it into the playoffs. You didn't want to see them get swept, but it was still a good sign that they were actually able to make it into the tournament. Well, excuse me for assuming, because as they got into the series, they were able to tie it because they finally got back home in Orlando. They won those 2 games relatively easily, but then you get back to Cleveland. They win that game at home, game 6. The Magic are back at home, but it's an elimination game. How are they going to be able to bounce back? They end up getting a 7-point win over the Cavs, and it comes down to a game 7. After I thought they were going to get swept, it comes down to game 7, and really, what's going to happen there? Well, Donovan Mitchell happened as the Cavs were able to get the 12-point win over the Orlando Magic, making them pack their bags. But the fact that they were able to make this a series, that is a good sign, and that is a team that I wonder if you can get a couple key pieces here and there and you're able to get that young group be able to develop more and more, that's a team that could be scary in these following playoffs in following seasons. Then you look towards the Milwaukee Bucks and the Indiana Pacers. Giannis was injured for a majority of the series, and he wasn't able to play. The Pacers end up getting that one in 6 games. They lost game 1, but they rattled off game 2, game 3, game 4 wins. Game 5, it came down to the Bucks, and they were able to get the dominant 115-92 win. They had a poor Indiana had a really good start shooting the ball. They were shooting the ball really well, but then as soon as you got into that second half, Milwaukee absolutely turned it around, but it didn't matter because it was a dominant win in Game 6 by the Pacers. Tyrese Halliburton and company were able to get that one done, even though they were the 6th seed and Milwaukee was the 3 seed. But you could kind of tell the fact that Giannis didn't play in the series. You move on from a young head coach early on in the season after you moved on from Budenholzer before that. Then you bring in Doc Rivers, who we know has a history of not being able to make it too far and being really disappointing with his teams in the playoffs. You could just tell that whole situation was a mess. Then you get to the Knicks and the Sixers, and that one was a very interesting series, of course. 2 East Coast teams. You know that those 2 fan bases do not like each other. And this one was relatively back and forth. The Knicks were able to get it in 6, but each one of these games were heavyweight battles. The fact that the Sixers were this close in so many of those games and they just weren't able to get it done late, it was kind of shocking because even though Joel Embiid wasn't 100%, and you know that there's a lack of depth when it comes to the bench for the Knicks, they were still able to get it done. They had a lot of close games. The Knicks somehow were able to eke wins here and there. Jalen Brunson has been an absolute phenom, and this has been without Julius Randle. So it's big props. And Jalen Brunson has become the star and the best player on that team. But the fact that guys like Josh Hart and Isaiah Hartenstein, they've been able to really step up for this team. And same thing with OG Anunoby. Those guys have been able to step up and elevate from even being just guys that are doing a specific role for the team. They were able to get the series, and move on, and then they had to take on the Indiana Pacers. For them, so far, the Pacers, they lost game one against the Knicks, but it's interesting because both of them are very fast paced, but I wonder how much longer can you see the Knicks play with basically only five guys? Because the bench, they have just been an absolute nothing as of late throughout the whole postseason. Jalen Brunson, how many more 40-point games are we going to be able to see out of him? Because it's not like he's a 6'6, 6'7, 6'8 wing that is able to create shots relatively easily. He's only a 6'2 point guard. And as you get into it, farther into history, you don't see a lot of guys that are shorter than 6'6, and the team's best player is below that height and below 6'3, 6'4. Usually when their best player is below that height, they don't make it as far into the playoffs. Now, I think this team of the Knicks is a good one. They're coached really well. They have a lot of good players that are putting in that extra effort. I love the fact that Josh Hart has become an absolute X factor for this team for their success. But in the long haul, as you get farther into the series, if the Pacers are able to turn this to 6, make this get to a game 7, I worry about them as they get into the Eastern Conference Finals, whether they have to face the Cavs or they have to face the Sixers. If it comes down to it, I still think the Knicks get it done, but I do worry about the long term when it comes to the further part of the playoffs, when they have to play in game 3, game 4, maybe game 5 or 6 against the Celtics or the Cavs. And speaking of both of them, at this point, I would probably have to say the Celtics are going to be able to get it done. I was worried about this matchup because it feels like every time that I had seen the Cavs play the Celtics, every time I see those two match up, the Cavs are always able to elevate to that next level. And it was also worrisome because Kristaps Porzingis got injured in last series against the Heat, and he's supposed to miss, quote-unquote, several games. But after watching what had happened in Game 1, I don't think I have to worry about it. This series should be done in 4 or 5 because not only do the Celtics not have Kristaps Porzingis at the moment, but then the Cavs don't have their center either. They don't have their big man in Jared Allen. So I think that's a big piece. Even though he's not a huge contributor offensively, if they were able to grab rebounds and prevent guys like Drew Holiday and Peyton Pritchard from getting offensive rebounds and creating extra opportunities for Jason Tatum, Jaylen Brown, and company, you could see this get a little bit closer. Maybe we get to a game 6. But at the moment, if Jared Allen isn't going to play, this is just going to be utter dominance from the Boston Celtics, and I expect to see them in the Knicks in the Eastern Conference Finals. Then looking at the Western Conference once again, Oklahoma City and the Mavericks. I know that Luka isn't 100% healthy at the moment, but the Oklahoma City Thunder look much better of a team at the moment. I know I talked about that dynamic duo of Luka Doncic and Kyrie Irving, but at this point, the way the Thunder are constructed, it just works so well because Shai Gilgeous-Alexander, he's almost guaranteed 25 a night. Him and Chet Holmgren have become that 1-2 punch themselves, but then they have the two Jalen Williamses, and then they also have Lou Dort. You've got a couple of other guys that come off the bench as well, and they've all been key contributors, and they are just a team that even though they don't go on these crazy 22-4 runs, the 16-3 runs to take a huge 20-point lead, you see them get little runs here and there, and you saw it last night in Game 1 as they were able to win that one and take the early lead in that series. I fully expect to see the Oklahoma City Thunder to make it to the conference finals, even though they are one of the younger teams as well in the NBA. And then looking at the final series, the Timberwolves, they just continue to dominate. They had to go early into their series because the fact the Timberwolves swept the Suns, and then you see the Lakers get eliminated in 5. They finished and they started their series before we were even done with the Cavs and the Magic. And so far, the fact that the Timberwolves won both games on the Nuggets' home floor, and they are playing that kind of defense, that smothering defense where you're playing trap against Jamal Murray. Nikola Jokic doesn't look like himself. You got Michael Porter Jr., who's still trying to do his thing, but Aaron Gordon, you're trying to rely on him to make a late game 3 to make this a game and potentially try and steal one at home. just the way the team is playing Anthony Edwards, Rudy Gobert, who didn't even play in game 2 because of the birth of his child, even without him in the lineup, they were still able to play that dominant of defense. At this point, I thought this was going to be in favor of the Nuggets. I thought it was going to be a 7-game series. But at this point, I'd be shocked if the Nuggets were able to get 2 games out of this. The Timberwolves have been absolutely dominant. They seem to be the best team in the NBA in the playoffs. And I say that as the fact that the Boston Celtics are supposed to be the betting favorite to win the championship. The way the Timberwolves are playing, that is scary, and that worries me because of what I had mentioned before. The Celtics rely on the 3-ball too much, and then you have the Timberwolves forcing turnovers, forcing bad shots, getting rebounds, creating extra opportunities on their end of the floor. That just spells disaster, not only for the Nuggets and for potentially either the Mavericks or the Thunder, but also whoever they maybe play in the finals. That's going to do it for this edition of Cleats and Sneaks. Appreciate you listening in. Don't forget to like and subscribe to our YouTube channel, ESPN Southwest Louisiana. And don't forget to turn on that notification bell and get notified every time we upload any one of our podcasts, not just this one. We also have Over Par with Matt Miguez. He's also got the Miguez Mindset. But then we have the 4 Tire Change with Dawson Igelo and plenty of other local content when it comes to the LSU Tigers, the Louisiana Raging Cajuns, the McNeese Cowboys, the New Orleans Saints, and so much more. Appreciate you listening in. We'll be back next week when we look further into the NBA playoffs, see who's in the conference finals if we're done with any of these series, and I'll be able to further look at the previous games of this upcoming week. Appreciate you listening in. I'll talk to you next time.